Hi, folks. Welcome to Rewriting the Rules of Exposure Management. My name is H.T. Moore, co-founder and CEO of RunZero. Founded the company in 2018 as a single source of truth for exposure management and the best way for organizations to minimize risk across their total attack surface. We have about 500 customers across all sizes and commercial and public sectors, and about 30,000 users of our community edition, including small businesses and individuals. We've recognized quite a bit in the industry for being a fast-growing startup and having customer choice for Chasm, and you can see some of our customers here below. So today I want to talk about kind of where all this started. So in the beginning, they were hackers. Hackers pretty much drive all of security. They are both the reason why we're here and the penalty for failure. It wasn't for people actively attacking our stuff. We wouldn't have to worry about defending it. And end of the day, these are humans who are actively going after our stuff, and then also humans actively defending them. So where did all this begin? If you go back to 1995, Dan Farmer and White's Venema created a tool called Satan. And they also included a story with the tool called Improving the Security of Your Site by Breaking into It. It was the first time that folks had really argued for doing proactive security assessments as part of hardening your security. Prior to this point, folks were very much focused on defending, trying to identify all the different weaknesses kind of ahead of time by hardening your host, but not actively looking for vulnerabilities. So in order for us to keep up as an industry with what hackers are doing, we had to start building our own security scanning tools, starting off with Satan, and then later on turning into many different commercial and open source tools, including things like Tenable, Nessus, OpenVAS, Nuclei, etc. So if you're creating a vulnerability check, you need to, especially an unauthenticated vulnerability check, you need to find some way for the remote service to tell you that either the patch is not installed or it's misconfigured in a certain way. Now, for things like a default login check, you would just try to log in and see if it works. For missing patches, though, and misconfigurations, they can be a little bit trickier. In my prior work with Metasploit project, we built exploits. And one of the features of the exploits we built was also a vulnerability check function. And oftentimes, the vulnerability check function took far longer to build than the exploit itself. So exploits are already pretty tricky, especially memory corruption bugs where you're trying to like tickle memory a certain way or cause code execution a certain way. But at the same time, the vulnerability checks were often much trickier because you need to either exercise a vulnerability or determine that it's there, but in doing so without crashing the service. So as a result, unauthenticated remote vulnerability checks are pretty hard to write and they take a lot of time. If you fast forward about 2 decades, most of the vulnerability scanning industry is concentrated into 3 vendors. At this point, Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7 control the majority of the market for vulnerability management. And while there are other vendors out there, they're nowhere near as large in terms of market share. This competition really kind of shrunk the variability of checks, kind of shrunk the creativity of vulnerability checks. And we've also seen these 3 vendors kind of go off in different directions and no longer just focus on vulnerability assessment. So in addition to vulnerability assessment, these companies' portfolios now include everything from next-gen SIEMs, attack surface management, cloud-native app protection, just-in-time authentication, a lot of things that are definitely not vulnerability assessment. So the question is, okay, well, if folks aren't spending their time in vulnerability assessment, are they still good at it? And today I want to argue that no, they've kind of left it languish, and I want to clarify how and why we have that view. So if you go all the way back to 1999, this is what vulnerability scanning tools look like. The reporting function would tell you the number of vulnerabilities by severity, percent of vulnerabilities by severity, give you a list of operating systems, how they're broken down. You see all kinds of cool stuff here like BSDI, Cisco, HPUX, Linux, etc. And yeah, this is kind of what you had back in 1995. This is the tools that are available. Now, if you fast forward to 2025, it's not that different. We're looking at basically the same graphs, the same information, the same reporting. Oftentimes, even the same fingerprinting hasn't been updated in these tools. So it doesn't feel like we've really gone very far in 26 years in terms of at least the reporting function here. If you look at how unauthenticated coverage over time has been increased, it mostly hasn't. What we've seen instead is unauthenticated coverage has been atrophying across the board. In this case, this is Qualys's unauthenticated coverage. You can see over time, they've mostly focused on authenticated coverage. So authenticated only scanning, agent-based scanning, et cetera. And the red line down here is the number of checks that were added for unauthenticated checks. And for a brief moment after 2000 and before 2005, the majority of checks that Qualys and firms like them produced were unauthenticated remote checks. That's just how you did things. That's why you did them. But it got really hard between endpoint firewalls, starting with Windows XP SP3, folks moving their devices around the network more often, more mobile laptops, more BYOD. Authenticated only scanning and agent-based scanning really became the easier way to do it. As a result, unauthenticated scanning really languished. So I want to take a look at some of the counts across these products. So these stats are as of May 2025 using public resources. So hopefully they're accurate. Did my best to make sure that they represent what the vendors themselves say about themselves. And here you can see that Qualys has about 217,000 checks, Tenable 211,000, Rep7 233,000, and so on. Even Greenbow and OpenPass with enterprise speed is 206,000. So kind of all in the same rough range of counts. But if you look at the total CVE count, they're a little different, 80K to 111K. And even though these CVE numbers are, pretty similar in terms of overall scope, they often aren't the same CVEs. They actually may not overlap as much as it seems like. So depending on what vendor you pick, you may actually get a totally different set of CVEs, and you may get it, quite a few that are missing or quite a few that are overlap, don't overlap with the other set. What's also interesting to look at is the number of unique CVEs published just in 2024 or covered in 2024, number of CVEs with the word 2024 in the name for bugs found during that year that were published in the last year. So 13,000 out of 111,000 is quite a bit. That's like 10% of the entire bucket, especially for CVEs going back 20 years. That's quite a big percentage of them being just last year. And there's a similar ratio for number of checks that don't have a CVE at all. These are vulnerabilities that are misconfigurations, missing authentication of various senses, weaknesses of various forms. And lastly, the number we want to look at is the remote unauthenticated CVE checks. This number is fairly small at 12,000. So these are the types of CVEs that you can check for if you don't have credentials against a target, if you're not able to authenticate to it, if you're not able to put an agent on it. This is how many checks actually apply in terms of number of CVEs. And this number is also pretty similar all the way down, with the only real outlier here being Greenbone, where they've got about twice as many versus the total count. So if you look at how much of the total coverage of these products is actually unauthenticated scanning, it's fairly rare. It's right between 5 and 15%, depending on the product. Nuclei stands out that almost all of their checks are actually unauthenticated just based on how they built it. But everybody else, you're looking at like 10 to 15%, 5 to 15%, a pretty small number. And why is that, right? So that's the challenge here. Well, if you look at the CVs themselves, again, there's a little bit of overlap, but then again, the numbers don't really correlate between CVs and checks. Oftentimes, the same CVE will have multiple checks in the product. So, for example, if you're looking for an OpenSH vulnerability, you'll create a unique check for every single Linux distribution based on the missing patch. And then you also have a check for, let's say, Windows or for a generic one. And so you may end up having like 6 or 7 checks for the same CVE, which is why the check numbers are much higher than the CVE numbers. What's interesting is in 2024, or at least CVEs that were tagged 2024 dash something, a much higher percentage of those were added in the last a year than previous years. So you can see that 13K out of 11K CVEs in Qualys, those were all effectively for 2024 CVEs. It's a really large portion of the set. Since these go all the way back to the late 90s, having 13,000 cover a single year is excessive. So something happened last year that really accelerated the number of CVEs that are out there. And we see this pattern showing up in Rap7 as well, likely Tenable if we had the data for it. And even Nuclei had 400 of 3,000 checks, 3,000 CVE checks covered just in the last year alone. So something else to look at is the acceleration of unauthenticated coverage. So in this case, this is Qualys's unauthenticated coverage year by year. You can see it's mostly been under 1,000, sometimes as low as 59, all the way over here to 1,100 a few years ago, 801 2 years ago. And then we saw this giant jump to 2,026 checks in the year 2024. So Qualys obviously realized there's value in doing unauthenticated coverage and had a 100% increase in their coverage per year, which is great. We also saw that in 2025, they're actually above where they were in 2024 already, and the year isn't over yet. So there's actually been an acceleration of unauthenticated coverage in the market, which is interesting and fascinating and tells us a lot about what the risks look like out there. And also keep in mind that many critical exposures don't actually have a CVE. So if you're focused on CISA-KEV, well, the CISA-KEV list is only vulnerabilities with CVE. So almost by definition, a database with authentication, misconfiguration, a default login, those wouldn't end up CVEs. They wouldn't end up on a CISA-KEV list. So if you're only focusing on fixing vulnerabilities on the list, obviously you're not going to get coverage for those. So overall, no CVE check percentages are about the same as unauthenticated CVE check percentages. They're kind of a smallish portion. And that kind of makes sense. But something else to point out here is these also include things like hygiene issues, kind of lesser critical misconfigurations, like using SMB v1 in an environment or older TLS ciphers, things like that, that won't get you directly compromised, but definitely contribute. Mandiant put out a report they call M-Trends this year that looks back at 2024. And in that report, they said 30% of all the initial access vectors were actually exploit driven. So there's still a pretty significant number of breaches driven just by remote exploits. So in general, vulnerability management is really about winning the race. You're trying to identify and mitigate vulnerabilities in your environment before an attacker is able to exploit it. And that's pretty much it. So you're constantly trying to figure out, what do I have? What is it vulnerable to? Does an attacker have an exploit? Are they actively exploiting it? And running that cycle as fast as you possibly can to stay ahead of a breach. And it's stressful. It's basically like the worst kind of scavenger hunt. So going back to the MTrends report again, so Mandiant reported that of all the breaches that they investigated in 2024, the top four initial access vectors were these vulnerabilities. These were really covered by three vendors, and three of these four were exploited as 0 days first, which means that they were being exploited by attackers before even the vendor was aware of these vulnerabilities. So interesting enough, all three of these vendors are also security vendors. So the number one way into an organization, according to Mandiant's incident response, was through your Palo Alto firewall, which is a little bit ironic all by itself. And next up was Ivanti through their Connect Secure VPN product, and then Fortinet, FortiClient EMS. So it's somewhat disturbing that the most common way into networks these days is actually through security products. So we want to take a look at these four vulnerabilities in particular and say, how well did the vendors in the space do in terms of covering these vulnerabilities? How quickly did they respond? So we went back and looked at, when did each one of these vendors put out both authenticated coverage, which is the column here with the A in it, and then unauthenticated coverage with EU. So looking at Tenable for the first vulnerability here, it was initially public on April 12th. It was on the CSIC Hev list April 12th. Tenable's unauthenticated coverage was May 21st, so a month and a half away. But they did same day coverage for authenticated coverage. Now that seems good. However, keep in mind, a lot of folks don't configure credentials in Tenable for things like their firewalls. They may have authenticated scanning through for SSH, for Linux, for Cisco's, for the Windows desktops through AD, but they may not have configured a connector specifically for Palo Alto, in which case authenticated connection here doesn't actually apply. They would, those customers would have had to wait till May 21st to update the product, to run a scan to get coverage for it. And you go across the board here, this vulnerability wasn't too bad. Greenbow missed it, from what I can tell, for unauthenticated coverage. Nuclei had same week coverage, which is great. Run Zero, we do rapid responses. We covered all these basically same day. So going down the line a little bit further here, look at two Ivanti bugs. Tenable did a pretty good job of almost same day coverage in both cases here for unauthenticated coverage. Rap7 is pretty close as well a few days later. Qualys was a little bit slower, so about not quite a month away, but definitely a few weeks. And then Greenmo didn't cover it all. And Nuclei was pretty close, pretty much on track. Within a week, they covered it as well. And then going into Fortinet, this is interesting because Tenable actually, as of May this year, has not shipped unauthenticated coverage at all for it. So unless you have a Fortinet connector set up in your Tenable scanning environment, you're not going to get coverage for this vulnerability at all. And you can see here that the vulnerability was reported March 12th. Tenable put authenticated coverage out on the 14th. Rap7 put out authenticated coverage only, but not till November of that year, and did not ship unauthenticated coverage at all. Qualys did ship unauthenticated coverage, but onto the following year until January 21st, 2025. And again, they've got authenticated coverage, but again, you'd have to have configured a connector to get that benefit. And in this case, Greenbone actually shipped pretty much on time, both unauthenticated and authenticated. So it just tells you, like, it doesn't really matter. All these products have their flaws, all these products have their own timelines, but sometimes it's hard to tell which ones are better than others just by looking at total number of checks, especially for these types of vulnerabilities. In this case, Nuclei added unauthenticated coverage as well, but again, it was a little bit late compared to the other vendors. It wasn't quite as far off as Qualys, but it definitely was further off than everybody else by many months. So the question was, like, are these four vulnerabilities unique in some way? Are they weird? Are they outliers? Did something else go wrong? So we want to take a look at another vulnerability. So we picked one that looked kind of like it from this year. This was a pre-authentication command execution vulnerability in a Sonic Wall firewall. So very similar to an Ivanti, secure VPN or a Fortinet or a Palo Alto firewall. So this vulnerability was found in the wild, so exploited in the wild, just like three of the four before, identified by Microsoft. At some point, Microsoft told SonicWall about it, and then SonicWall at some point got together and released a patch. And of course, it was added to the CISA noted exploited vulnerabilities list on the same day that the patch went out. Now, if you know how CISA operates, they typically need 2 weeks before they recognize a vulnerability in the wild as being exploited before they add it to the list. So you start backing up that timeline, and probably the earliest exploitation for this probably happened in 2024, not 2025. So that's a pretty long window of exploitation when attackers are able to go around popping boxes before anyone else was aware of the vulnerability, including the vendor. So how did everyone respond? So again, the vulnerability in this case was public as of January 22nd. It was on the Kev on January 24th. Tenable did January 24th coverage, so that looks great. Unfortunately, there's a caveat. So in this case, even though Tenable released unauthenticated coverage for it, it wasn't enabled by default. You'd have to go enable paranoid and thorough mode, which can slow down your scan and isn't on by default, to be able to get that check. So even though you may have been using Tenable, you may have updated quickly, may have run the scan, you may not have gotten coverage for it. And you probably didn't know you didn't get coverage for it unless you happen to go look through the plugins and realize you needed these special options set for the coverage. Now, if you look at Rapid7, they did unauthenticated coverage a little bit later, about a week later, and that one looked fine. Qualys skipped it entirely. I'm not sure why. This is as of May 15th this year, so it may have been updated since. Greenbone shipped it very quickly within a day, unauthenticated. Nuclei didn't cover it all, at least as of May. And Run Zero, of course, we do rapid responses, which cover them all kind of same day. What's interesting about this vulnerability in particular is that the installer for it is still vulnerable. If you buy a SonicWall 8200V and you go download the virtual appliance, it'll still be unpatched when you install it. You have to know to run the installation and then go back to the download page and scroll through a whole bunch of patches, find the most recent patch at the very bottom, manually go upload that patch to the virtual appliance, and then you're able to actually patch the device. But the process for patching it is not particularly great. And there's likely to be more vulnerable devices in the future just because of the headache involved in patching it. Something else worth looking at is the scanning cycles for vulnerability scans. This is a really cool report by Tyler Shields of ESG Group. And what he did is he asked about 600 CISOs, or at least 600 security owners within large companies, how often they do vulnerability scanning, among a bunch of other questions. And what's really interesting about this is more than half of them, like far more than half of them, were only doing monthly or quarterly scanning. That doesn't really work, right? If you're being told there's a 0-day vulnerability and it's already being exploited in the wild the same day you hear about it, you can't wait a month to scan for it. You can't wait a quarter to scan for it. You can barely, you probably can't even wait a week. Even a day is actually kind of a stretch to be able to action that before you get compromised. So effectively, like if you're kind of on the left side of this curve here, you're going to have incidents, and there's really no way around it besides turning every one of these breaches into a fire drill, or every one of these new vulnerabilities to a fire drill to find and respond to affected systems before they're compromised. But your scanning sequence here is not going to be quick enough to keep up. So what happens when you lose that race? So an example of that is a Cisco vulnerability from a couple years ago. This is a vulnerability in the Cisco iOS XE platform. It was in the web UI, exploitable by default when web UI is enabled. There's about 145,000 systems exposed in it that were exploitable at the time. And all the way back in September 28 of 2023, Cisco TAC identifies exploits in the wild. They start getting questions from customers. They start digging into it. They identify that, hey, something's happening. It takes them a while to kind of get everything together. And finally, October 16th, they put an advisory out in IOCs. So the challenge here is there's also no patch. So by the time Cisco is able to tell customers about it, all they could say is, hey, these are being exploited by what looks like a Chinese state actor. Here's what to look for on your system to see whether you've already been backdoored or not. But sorry, we don't have a patch yet. Just turn the service off for now. And over the next month or so, basically leading up to the patch, more and more of these devices are exploited and backdoored. At one point, all of the remaining systems on the internet are confirmed as backdoored. And then they all disappeared, and no one could figure out why. And fast forward to the day or so, what happened was the attackers actually changed their backdoor, so it was difficult to detect. And then once folks figured that out, they can go through and rescan them and find them again. So in this case, Cisco released an update on October 22nd, and then October 23rd, someone rescanned, used the new backdoor password, and identified still almost 40,000 devices that are backdoored. So this is what happens when things go horribly wrong. Now, there's a couple categories of vulnerabilities that we thought were really interesting, and this is one that definitely surprised us. So there's a vendor called Nutanix. They do kind of a VMware competitor, hyperscale, virtualization, et cetera. They've got a pretty cool platform, and it's pretty popular. It's actually second most popular, just behind VMware in the market. So what was interesting is we went and looked at all the major platforms and said, do you guys have coverage for Nutanix? And just by looking at the public stats, you can see Tenable 74, Nuclei had 1. And that's it. None of these have CVEs either, which is interesting because these are all critical vulnerabilities. Yet there's not a single CVE allocated for any of these vulnerabilities. So again, these would not end up on a CISA Kev list or anything like that. And if you go look at the Tenable ones in more detail, these actually require an API connector or credentials. So if you didn't realize you had Nutanix in your environment and you're just running normal scans, you wouldn't get any of this detection. And if you happen to have Nutanix, you still need to know what the credentials were, set that up, add that to your scan configuration before you get any coverage at all. And if not even running Tenable, then obviously you don't get coverage at all. The nuclei check is pretty minor. So we're kind of scratching our heads at this, like, why would this really popular virtualization platform, one, have no CVEs, and two, have very little coverage across the board in scanners? Like, is there something really difficult about scanning it? Is it like impossible to get the version information remotely? So we set one up, poked that a little bit, and lo and behold, in the first, 30 seconds of logging into the device, you actually get the version number coming back in your browser. So literally the first request your browser makes after loading the login page is this API endpoint that returns the exact version. So it's not like there's a technical reason why folks didn't do this. It's just one of those cases where for some reason folks didn't add coverage. There's authenticated only coverage, which makes no sense because you don't need authentication really to do these checks. You can go straight off the version number here. And you can see based on the end of life versions, they end of life things pretty quickly as well. So by the time folks check on these devices, they may already be end of life, in which case no new vulnerabilities would be released. They would just stop telling you about vulns. So when you get into identifying vulnerabilities, there's definitely a few ways you can do it. You can do active scanning or active unauthenticated scanning. You can do password detection. You can do authenticated scanning. You can do agent-based discovery, and you can use APIs. Um, Unauthenticated scans are great in that they correlate with the attacker's perspective. Anytime you're able to do an unauthenticated scan, any results you get back are going to be the same thing that an attacker would see. So if your scan comes back and finds a service, an attacker would find the service the same way. It's a realistic vulnerability. You should go fix it, et cetera. The downside, of course, is that anything with an endpoint firewall and a different network, off network entirely, in a different cloud, you're not going to get visibility unless you know to scan it or you've got some way to get a scan onto that device. And as we saw before, there's a lot less coverage. Only about 10% or 5 to 15%, depending on the device or vendor, of those checks actually cover unauthenticated scanning. So if you don't have a credential, you don't have an agent, you're only going to get a small amount of coverage basically with those tools. And of course, a lot of folks are concerned because you can disrupt networks, crash devices, you can cause printers to spit out paper by running these tools. But again, the value here is that if an unauthenticated scan tells you about something, you know it's real. So contrast that with authenticated scans. So these give you lots of deep detail. They're able to log into the OS, enumerate the registry, things like that, list files, run commands. Similar challenges to unauthenticated scanning, though, in that if a device is firewalled off, if it's in a different network, you still can't talk to it. And even worse, if it has a different authentication realm, it's not part of your main domain controller, it's on a secondary AD, it's vendor managed, it's something else, you're not going to be able to actually authenticate to it correctly. And the failure mode here is it just doesn't report any vulnerabilities. You only get your unauthenticated coverage. So a lot of these products are really bad at telling you what they don't know. When you normally do authenticated scanning and then you find a device you can't authenticate to, you don't really get a big red flag saying, hey, I couldn't authenticate. And some products have the ability to report that, but it's pretty rare for someone to say, oh no, that was a huge issue, let's go back and fix it. It's one of those things that just tend to get swept under the rug or forgotten about. The more serious issue about authenticated scanning, though, is that any attacker on the network can put up a service, listen for a request, and basically capture your authentication credentials, either crack them, store them, relay them, and then basically take over your environment using those credentials. Oftentimes, these credentials are domain admin, and they shouldn't be, but unfortunately, they often are. And even a lot of the documentation for these tools tells people they need to use domain admin to be able to get full coverage. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with authenticated scanning. You can either not scan with credentials, in which case you get very limited coverage, or you can scan with credentials and risk losing your credentials to an attacker already in the network. And of course, your vendor managed systems, your shadow IT, these are the ones that are not going to get covered by authenticated scans because you're not part of the same authentication domain. And of course, they're often the ones that are most at risk. So the third way that folks typically do vuln scanning is through agents. So if you're able to install an agent on the machine, great. You can get great detailed vulnerability data. It's safer, it requires consistent deployment to be useful, but it does miss all your BYOD, your OT, your IoT, your network devices, your vendor appliances, and of course, any device that doesn't support the agent, including an unsupported operating system or an older OS. The challenge too is when these report vulnerabilities, they typically don't know whether they're network reachable. So let's say you get a critical alert from your server, and the critical alert is a CV number, and you go look it up and say, oh, okay, this is an outdated Adobe reader or Adobe PDF reader. Well, do you care? Do you care that your server that no one logs into has an outdated PDF reader? Probably not, because it's not going to be exploited. But if you look at just the CVEs themselves coming from these things, that's what you're going to be working with. So the prioritization process is a lot tougher when you're working with agent-based vulnerability data. And then lastly, there's products out there that aggregate vulnerability data. Some of these are VPT products, some of these are CASM products. With RunZero, we aggregate data across all your vuln scanners, but also your EDRs, MDMs, et cetera. And so we bring in data from everything that's available and we put it together, we match assets, we do all that fun stuff. The problem though, of course, is you're only as good as your source data. If you're missing assets across the board, using a CASM product is not going to solve it. We often find that even for customers who have come from another Chasm product where they've used everything from DNS logs, DHCP, et cetera, they're still missing about 25% of assets in the network. And the challenge, of course, is that every source of data is going to have a different level of fidelity. So some systems will give you great data, some won't. Sometimes you just get a host name, sometimes you get an IP address. Oftentimes you just get an IP and that's it. And so it's really hard to know what that device is without additional data on it. You also have challenges with mismerging duplication because when you don't have a lot of good data about each asset, you have no real good context for matching and merging. So to give an example of what that looks like kind of visually, here's a network of 12 devices. I've got some Windows machines, Linux, Mac, etc. Devices with a firewall icon. These ones that have a local firewall, which means you can't just connect them on SMB or port 22 and talk to them. The ones that are marked VM, these are virtual machines provided by a vendor. So you can't just log into them. You can't install an agent. They probably have firewalls enabled as well in some cases, but maybe not. And then on the very bottom here, you've got your UPS, your network UPS. You've got your Palo Alto firewall and a Fortinet device. So what happens when you actually start doing these different types of discovery? So first, with your unauthenticated scanner, you'll actually get pretty good coverage. You actually get everything except for the firewall devices will come back in an unauthenticated scan. Now, granted, you're only going to get 5 to 15% of coverage. You're at least going to be able to get data from most of these systems. Compare that to authenticated scan, where you actually can only talk to 3 of these. It's an upgrade, right? So you can't really just do authenticated or unauthenticated. You kind of have to do both in this case. And then this still misses devices with firewalls because neither one, authenticated and unauthenticated, can talk to a firewall device. So you install an agent, and now you're able to go through and install these agents on these firewalled assets, get a little more data. But again, you can't install an agent on your vendor appliances. You can't install an agent on those hardware products down here at the bottom. And so it's still kind of missing some bits. So if you start aggregating all this data, you do get some visibility, but you only get a little bit of granularity, a little bit of detail for these hardware products. You only get a little bit of data for these VMs over here, because again, you're only getting unauthenticated scan data for effectively these 5 assets, even though you are able to get coverage on the rest. And this starts to get really ugly at scale. So if you look at what happens when you scale this up a little bit, you start finding these kind of dark spots across your network where there's assets that are missing, there's visibility that's missing. You just get IPs, you get a limited list of vulns, and you don't really know just by looking at it which one of these things have good vuln data versus bad vuln data. Like it's hard to tell which of these have an agent on them just at first glance. You'd have to use a Chasm tool to say search by source, et cetera. So you can do that with run zero. It's kind of what we do as well. But again, it's not really an easy thing to do by looking at your vulnerability data alone to determine how well your coverage is of each asset. And again, if you scale this up to like the size of a large enterprise, these gaps become a lot more apparent. Effectively, you lose visibility to about 25% of all your assets overall, and you've got partial data coverage for another large percentage of them, either between 40 and 60%. So end of the day, depending on which of these techniques you use or which combination, you still don't really get 100%. If you're using unauthenticated vuln scans only, you're only really covering about 40% of your assets. If you're doing authenticated vuln scans, you're typically only covering 25%. Because a lot of these are BYOD, a lot of these are firewalls, things like that, or other appliances. Now, if using agent-based vulnerability scans, even at the very best, even if you install an agent on every single thing you manage, you're probably not going to get past 50% because the other 50% are things like unsupported OSs, network devices, shadow IT, things like that. So you really struggle. Even if you combine all 3 of these and you hook them up to your Chasm product, you may only get 75%. And that's basically it. Like you can try to close the gap, but you need something better than these 3 options plus Chasm. You have to go a little deeper. So to tell you kind of what we do, so Run Zero, we try to provide the best-in-class exposure management. We do that by taking data from all these integrations, EDR, MDM, VM, et cetera, sync all your data, users, assets, groups, software vulns, et cetera. Great APIs, inbound, outbound, built-in scripting language to create your own custom integrations. And you can create arbitrary goals, track queries, things like that, all in the UI, create rules, and do alerts. So you want to be notified anytime you see an end-of-life operating system. You want to keep track of any time a network goes offline or goes dark or something that's old pops up. Those are all things you can do really easily inside Run Zero through this kind of Chasm architecture. But separately from that, we're also a really great source of data. So even if you don't have a single integration, a single agent, or any credentials, we'll give you best-in-class discovery. We'll give you a list of all the assets in your environment, whether you knew about them or not. And that includes things like crawling the different subnets, doing full RFC 1918 discovery, doing passive traffic sampling to find overlaying VLANs, all kinds of cool stuff. So we typically find 25% more stuff in customer environments just by the fact that our network discovery is that much better. And the best part about this is we can help you document your environment, and it's quick and it's safe and it works well with IoT, OT, et cetera. This discovery goes beyond just assets too. We're pulling in detailed service information, web screenshots. We can tell you the device is prohibited in your environment. Like, is it a Huawei? Is it a Dahua? Is it a Hikvision? We can do attack path routing. We can do network topology, security kernel enumeration, and so on. So a really great tool to quickly get a sense for what's in your environment, how's it configured, how's it protected. Um, in addition to that, we also do native vulnerability reporting. So we do that through 3 different ways as well. We create queries that match your existing data. So the great thing about this is, let's say there's a new vulnerability in Palo Alto and it just came out today. We'll give you an alert in email within 15 minutes, and it'll give you a link to go into your inventory and find every Palo Alto we've identified in your network. And you don't have to do any kind of rescans. We're matching data that's already there. So the whole process is really quick. You don't have to go rescan everything in the middle of the night. You don't have to spend your weekends digging through stuff. You get it in one click and you're done. So really quick way to mitigate vulnerabilities before getting compromised. Separately, we also do direct vulnerability scanning, and we do that by combining the run zero fingerprinting engine with Nuclei open source scanner. So instead of running just all the nuclei checks by default, we only run nuclei checks when they uniquely match a fingerprint from run zero for the relevant OS, application, service, etc. Now, the great thing about that, it means we just don't run very many checks. Like, the majority of vulnerability checks aren't applicable to the majority of hosts. So when you go start matching up vulnerability checks to assets, there's no real good reason to match a vuln check to an asset unless you know it's relevant to that system. And most vulnerability scanners don't bother separating that out, which is why they take so long. So we use the great fingerprinting we have available to be able to limit the number of vulnerability checks we run to just the ones that matter for that particular system, which means scans are quick, scans are safe, and we can identify all kinds of exposures from default logins, configuration flaws, and that's all prioritized by our AI-powered threat intelligence engine. Some other unique capabilities we have are inside-out attack surface management. We can identify cryptographic key outliers. We can do outlier detection, and we can find network pivot points from multi-home hosts. And again, these are all unauthenticated, uncredentialed, no agents. So our goal is to help you find the risks that matter the most. And like I mentioned before, we typically find 25% more stuff with Run Zero than what's already there, even if it is a CASM product. And we do that by crawling networks and looking, much harder than other products, the network layer, to find these things. That turns up all kinds of things from rogue assets, shadow IT, forgotten networks, vendor managed appliances and equipment, and devices that just don't have agents. And that 25%, of course, usually the most risky. It tends to be missing security controls because there's no agent on it, there's no EDR. It could be tied to a critical function, which is why it's still there and turned on in the first place. It could be unmanaged, misconfigured, because it could be a vendor appliance that just has been left alone. Especially vendor virtual appliances that tend to just kind of rot away on the vine because no one's updating the OS and those things. And oftentimes these things are exposed directly to the internet or they're end of life, which means they've got infinite levels of vulnerabilities. We're just not even tracking vulns for them anymore. So, and how we do that, we just do a much better job of fingerprinting. So for example, if you use a vuln scanner and it comes back and tells you an unknown device is running Linux, okay, great. That's not super helpful. What we do instead is say it's an IP camera, it's a TrendNet IP camera, it's this particular model. We found these things in like factory floors when they shouldn't be there. Another example is the vuln scanner might say it's Linux 3.2. We'll come back and say, no, it's actually a Chromecast media server. And yeah, it's running Linux 3.2 as the kernel. You don't care about that. You care what the device physically is. So identifying consumer, media servers in your work environment is something we do really quickly. We're also really good at identifying things like Nintendo switches, Xboxes, PS4s, PS5s, etc. So let's talk about what we don't do. So we track assets and vulnerabilities, not behaviors and conversations. We're not here to identify a device beaconing out to the internet. We're not trying to be your NSM, your NDR, your RDS. We'll identify services, but not service dependencies. So while we can tell you what's open in every asset, we're not going to say this device depends on this database, which depends on the storage backend. And we identify exposures, but not inbound attacks. We're not looking for attacks coming in. We're telling you what an attacker could do if they do get in. And we also don't do patch enumeration. We feel like this is something that's better done with IT shop. Like, you should be running WSUS, SMSS, Mecum, et cetera. You should be having auto updates where you can. And you don't really want to spend all this time running a bunch of vuln checks to say, did you or did you not apply this patch? Like, obviously, you should have patches applied wherever you can. What matters are the remotely exploitable critical vulnerabilities. That's what we look for. So similarly, while we can identify a lot of the hardware stuff, including through SNMP in some cases, we typically don't do hardware module level inventory. Like, we don't want to identify every line card in a switch. We can do some of that, but obviously there's better tools for that than Run Zero. A lot of our customers use this as a central hub for security operations. So our security operations team will put all the data into one spot, which tends to be Run Zero. They use our native active scanning and passive discovery to find everything else. And we monitor their external attack service, their domains, their ASNs, their cloud, their IP space, and we provide near real-time notifications for exposures for emerging threats. We're able to identify vulnerabilities across everything, unmanaged, managed, IoT, and OT. But Run Zero is also pretty good for the entire organization. Your IT team can use it for all sorts of stuff. Your incident response team can pull the data into either SIM, whether it's Splunk or something else. We're able to feed data into CMDBs like ServiceNow to fill in missing inventory. We provide a great knowledge base of your environment to support your audits, compliance, controls. And it's a great planning tool. If you want to be able to say, here's our current objective, we want to get this type of device offline, remove this server, remove this application, track the number of non-compliant assets. You can do all that directly in the Run Zero UI. We've got the ability to measure all that stuff, to set goals, notify you when the goals are reached, and so on. Now, if you're used to using the network discovery components of, let's say, your EDR or just your vuln scanner, Run Zero goes much further. So these products typically are limited to known subnets where they provide very little discovery information, where Run Zero goes super deep, super wide, but also super safe and super fast. And so we're able to identify vulnerabilities even in subnets that are nowhere near where you've installed Explorer. You don't require an agent per subnet. We don't require two agents per subnet like some of the EDRs do. And you're able to get a lot of really good information really quickly at low risk. So in a lot of cases, pairing Run Zero with your EDR or even vuln management of choice provides even better data. We can tell you what scopes your vuln management is missing. We can also tell you what vulns your vuln management is missing. And we can also help support the overall prioritization by pulling in both the Run Zero data and your vuln management data and overlaying context from your MDM and EDR. On the external side, typically your really important servers tend to be within a couple hops of the outer edge, and that's just normal. We provide hosted external scanning, no additional cost, no limits on frequency or port coverage. We do a really good job of identifying assets through IP ranges, automatic subnet discovery, subdomain discovery. We can pull external IP addresses from other tools, other integrations. So we can get a list of all your endpoints that are external and go from that. You can also overlay data from Shodan and Census for enrichment. And we also allow discovery of multi-homes assets and doing multi-perspective discovery. So how does an asset look like from the internet? How does it look like from the internal network? How does it look like from the DMZ? And be able to compare all that stuff. We're really good at identifying segmentation failures, finding unexpected port forwarding, and finding general unexpected internet exposures. And part of our rapid response program is being able to immediately tell customers they've got something exposed to the internet the second that we're aware of an active threat, and buy you as much time as possible to get ahead of the issue. Something that's pretty unique is what we call inside-out attack surface management. So oftentimes, external scanning will identify something that looks like it belongs to you. Like let's say a remote desktop port. It looks like it's your domain, it looks like your asset, but you don't really know, and you definitely don't know where that asset is internally. We go the other direction. We can start off with an internal discovery of your environment, uniquely fingerprint every single device inside the firewall, and then we can search the entire internet for those fingerprints and say, hey, we found this device on the internet way over here on a mobile WWAN card or an LTE or cellular modem or an IPv6 range you didn't realize you had. So it doesn't matter where that device is on the internet, we'll be able to find it, matching it up based on its cryptographic fingerprint. That includes things like SH keys, TLS certs, remote desktop, use the TLS fingerprint plus a serial number, all kinds of cool stuff like that. So the great thing about that is when we find an exposure like that, we already know exactly what the internal machine IP is and often who the owner is. You don't have to go chase down ownership. You already know who it is when you start. So the last thing we talk about is prioritization. If you look at most prioritization models, they tend to look like a funnel. You take a lot of stuff from the input, and then supposedly you do a bunch of like magic work to it, and then the output tends to be a narrower set of vulnerabilities you're supposed to care about. And the idea here is that you only have a certain number of cycles for remediation, and you need to spend those most wisely you can. And so there's lots of different ways to look at it. You got funnels, you got pyramids, you got charts, but generally they all have the same problem. They all assume that everything going into the funnel is accurate and comprehensive. So the standard model says you've got all your assets exposure data, you look for exploitability and likelihood, you mitigate by controls, and that's your actionable stuff. Now, the challenge, of course, is if you're trying to prioritize by exploitability, it's 2020 hindsight, it's too late. Something doesn't get added to the CSIC known exploitable list until it's already been exploited for at least 2 weeks. So if you wait for the KEV, you are the KEV in a lot of ways. And Qualys' report from 2023 says about an average lag time of about 23 days from when an exploit's released to when the CV is actually formally assigned. So there's a pretty big gap. We've also noticed that Grain always put out some research where they identify vulnerabilities that are being fingerprinted and exploited well before they're public or added to the KEV. And that's just how it is. Like the KEV is not going to know about things in advance. And if you wait for something to show up on a known exploited list, you're hoping that your neighbors are hacked before you are. You also can't really predict exploitation. Like, end of the day, this is a human being doing something. This is somebody who's going after you or going after a wide swath of systems. And yeah, you can kind of generalize and say, well, this looks easier to exploit or not. But at the end of the day, somebody has to hit that button. Someone has to actually drive that exploit. And it's really hard to predict that. It's not like the weather. It's basically human beings. So already exploited is a great predictor, except for if you're not in the, if you're not in the first wave of being exploited, that's great. Otherwise, it doesn't really help you very much. So kind of going into where the assumptions fall down here. You assume that all of your asset data is in the beginning of this funnel. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes you're missing stuff. You assume that your threat intelligence is valid for what's exploitable and what the likelihood is. You assume that your control mapping is correct and that you have an effective way to remediate. Now, reality is a little different, right? You've got missing assets, you've got missing bones, kind of half your pyramid may be gone to start with on the front end of this thing. So by the time you get to the top, you don't even have the right data to start with. Your filter by exploitability is really waiting for the bear to eat somebody else to tell you, oh, look, there's a bear. Oftentimes your controls may be in place, but not either turned on or enforced or comprehensive. And oftentimes the actionability part is hard. You may have created a ticket, but nobody actually actioned the ticket, or they thought they applied the patch, but didn't reboot, or things like that. So we really recommend going that direction. We say, like, keep track of all the technology in your environment, especially at the edge. Look for which ones are being actively exploited, filter by that tech, look at the controls, and then become actionability. So start off with everything being kind of actively attacked in the wild and work your way down to what's actually inside your network, and care less about, your inventory first. Care more about what the attackers are doing. Now, you still have to combine that with the existing program, right? You can't just ignore patches. You still have to do automatic patch management. But the good news is your automatic patches will cover about 90% of it. And a lot of your tools can already do that job. The challenge, of course, is coverage holes. Whenever you run into a device that's end of life, you no longer get a list of vulnerabilities for it. People stop tracking it. So it's an infinite black hole of vulnerabilities at this point. You have no idea what the risk is, except for it's probably bad. So we recommend combining both approaches, starting off with all the actively exploited exposures, moving all the way down to actionability, and then working bottoms up too. Take all your data, take all your assets you know about, and also move in. And going both directions here ends up covering a lot of stuff. Top down will cover your kind of emerging zero-day. Bottoms up will cover things like your technical debt and other challenges that are kind of at scale. And doing both approaches at once really helps you stay ahead of the curve. So the goal of all this is how to improve your response time. We really want to help you quickly respond to new vulnerability before an attacker is able to exploit it. And the way to do that is really aggregate all your data and then notify folks for emerging threats based on that data being present. And we recommend, of course, using Run Zero for that. There's lots of other ways to do it, but effectively you want to get all your data in one spot. You want to be able to quickly trigger alerts based on actively exploited technology. And it's tricky, it's hard, it's a lot of work involved. So we hope that Run Zero will be that security ops oracle for you and help you be able to create a successful security program. So thank you very much for your time today. Looking forward to your questions.